Hello, I am called Kim Biddulph and I work for the City of London Police Museum, and I'm here today with Dr. Clare Smith from the Metropolitan Police Heritage Service. Hello, Clare.
Hello.
Thank you for yeah, thanks for talking to us again. We thought it would be really good, didn't we, to talk a little bit about the history of women in the city and the Met Police, given that this is Women's History Month, March in 2021. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And obviously for you, you had a big anniversary a couple of years ago now, and did quite a lot of work on that. Now, I wanted to just tell everybody the difference again between the city and the Met Police. A lot of people don't even know that the City of London, which is that little black bit in the centre there, the original City of London, of course, where the Roman city was, has its own police force. And it's always been separate to the Metropolitan Police, which started off as the Metropolitan Police area was this kind of smaller bit around the city. And now, of course, it's come to encompass all of the London boroughs, which is a massive area. But the two police forces work together really well, but they do also have a little bit of a friendly rivalry, don't they?
This is usually where we get the, well, of course, city police officers are taller than Met police officers and lots of height jokes, but we won't go down that road today.
Oh, no, we won't mention that. But of course, but the Met also seems to have been slightly more progressive than the City of London Police in terms of having women police officers.
Yes. So the Met Police first employed women in police officer roles in 1919. They had employed women previous to this. So in the 19th century, they employed women as matrons. And these would be based at police stations, and they would search female prisoners, escort them, look after lost children. But it wasn't a policing role. And then in the early 20th century, in 1912, we have Miss McDougall employed. And she is given the rather grand title of Lady Assistant to the Commissioner. And it's her job is to take statements around cases of sexual assaults on women and children. So she's not a police officer. She is very much a statement taker. Mm. And then what happens is, as with so many other areas of life, World War I changes everything. So hundreds of men are going off to the front, including a lot of police officers. And it also feeds into the suffragette argument. So the arguments had been that women were being policed without their gender. So women were being policed by men. And this had been something that had been raised. And World War I saw women stepping into a lot of roles. Now, two groups that come to the fore in World War I, and it kind of gets a bit confusing because there are two groups doing very, very similar things, and then they have a change of name. So you have the one group which is led by Margaret Damer Dawson, Nina Boyle, Mary Allen, and they have been quite radical suffragettes, and they're very concerned with the idea of white slavery, women being abducted at railway stations, influx of men in uniform. Is this going to be difficult for women? So they start a volunteer patrol. And then the National Union of Women Workers, who become the National Council of Women, it's kind of one of these, you've got to keep up with the names changing, also start to do these patrols around London. And it's very much about moral welfare. So they don't have the power of arrest. They're not at this point connected to the Met. They're really kind of concerned with maybe a loosening of morality around World War I. There's more soldiers around, women are going out to work, households are changing. And this goes on, and there's been a huge, worry about will there be enough police officers. And in 1916, in January, the Daily Express asked Scotland Yard, will you employ women constables? And the response is, not if the war lasts for 50 years. So they are not at all taken with this idea. However, as the war progresses, the role of women patrols becomes really important. And the commissioner of the Met suddenly starts to think these women are actually a good thing. He doesn't want them to be full police officers, but he is seeing that they are doing a good job around women and children. And when the war ends, he goes to the National Council of Women, who are sort of the less radical group, and recruits from them to become the first Metropolitan Police women. Now, again, it's quite confusing at this point because they're not allowed to be called constables. So they are the Metropolitan Police Women Patrols, and a small number of women are recruited. And the photograph that we can see on screen is from May 1919. And this is the first time that they've been seen in their uniforms. So this is the first time they have worn the uniform of the Metropolitan Police. The rather formidable lady who's slightly glaring at us in the front row is Mrs. Stanley, and she's the first superintendent of women. She's come from the patrol groups, and she's had to do everything really, including order their uniforms. Nobody had really thought about what they'd wear. So Mrs. Stanley did what any woman of her class did at this time. When you have and she ordered the police uniforms. So the first uniforms were made by Harrods. And she sets up the patrols. She allocates women across the areas. She's very, very strict with the women. Initially, she doesn't want them to be based in the same area for too long. She wants them to keep moving around stations because she doesn't want them fraternizing with the police officers. There's a real fascination from the public with them. They don't know what to call them at first. So Lillian Wiles, who's one of the first intake, records that she was called a lady policeman because there was no real idea what you could call these women. And this, although they start with the Met in 1919, they're not given the power of arrest until 1923. So it's quite a long time before they can actually arrest anyone. You know, it would very much be you would rely on your male colleague to step in and do the arrest. Now, in 1922, the government are looking to save money, and one of the things they want to cull are women police because they say they're not really doing enough to justify the cost. Of course, not giving them power of arrest doesn't help that. And there's a real fight in Parliament, and it's the two female MPs at the time who really fight to keep these women. One of the male MPs says, well, why do we need to pay them? Can't we just ask the policemen's wives to do their jobs? And Lady Astor replies that policemen don't choose their wives for their ability to escort prisoners. So it's a hard, even when they are in, there's a hard fought battle to keep them and to actually, you know, respect what they're doing. And as time goes on, they get to the 23, they get the power of arrest, but they're very much seen as women and children's crimes. So they do actually, it's one of those great unfair ironies. They're earning less than the men, but they're doing more training. So they do an additional training on things such as child abuse cases, missing persons, prostitution, sexual assaults. You can argue that for the first, say, 50 years, it's as much social work as it is policing. So you have this very much focus on women and children. Now, that doesn't stop them being involved in you know, detecting crime, in reporting crime, arresting people. We know that, for example, the acid bath murderer, John Haigh, when he first came to police attention, it was Sergeant Lambourne who took his statement because he was reporting a missing persons case and she was taking the report. And she became suspicious of him. So there was something that didn't sit right about what he was telling her. And she raised it with her CID colleagues. So although they're being quite limited initially in what they can do, you know, they're certainly policing in the broader sense. It does take time, a lot of time, for them to kind of get to the point where their male colleagues are. For example, in 1931, the rules were changed so that women had to resign when they married. It changed again after the war that they could stay on when they were married. They couldn't take fingerprints until 1937. They weren't allowed to do that. And And it's really the sort of 1970s onwards that you see the biggest developments. So 1970, for the first time, women can serve in mounted branch. 1971, they can serve with police dogs. And in 1973, with the Equal Opportunities Act, there stops being the separation of male and female police officers. Now it's that anybody who's a police officer should be able to do anything. Although there's this great line about, anything within their ability. So it's not quite as straightforward as we would like. But it's only 1990 that the W is dropped from WPC. So it does take a while. Only 1976 that trousers can be worn on duty. And really through to 2003 is the first female lead of Special Branch and the Flying Squad. So it is progressive, but it certainly takes a while. And it really has been, I would argue, in the last 10 years that women have been able to really explore the opportunities that policing in the Met allow. And if we go to the next slide, we can see we are now at the point where, you will see women and men within the Met doing exactly the same jobs. And that's a huge step forward and such an important thing for London. One of the things that I'm really conscious of is policeman and policewoman. So police officer, you don't need to, firefighter, police officer. It doesn't need to be differentiated by gender. The uniforms are virtually the same now. The roles are the same. And one of the drives that the Met has had since 2019 is 50-50 policing. So to raise the level of women to 50% of the police force, because we are 50% of the population. We want to see that representation. It's really interesting, having looked at 100 years in 2019. The Met has come under criticism for, things didn't go fast enough, and they didn't, and that's absolutely true. But if we go to the next slide, in 2017, the Met appointed its first female commissioner. So that's from 1919, where you didn't have the power of arrest if you're a woman, to 2017, there's a woman in charge of the Metropolitan Police. That is actually a huge progression. And if we think about equivalent organisations, say Army, Navy, Air Force, which is a similar age to women in the Met, they haven't had a female in the most senior role. So I think it's a huge achievement, and it really is down to the sort of tenacity of the first women who joined and who put up with, as Lillian Wiles recalls, being told to get back to her wash tub, and the difficulties that the women faced. But it's been a huge journey and a hard journey, but it's really interesting to trace the development. And I think you can argue developments in society mirror developments within women's experience in the Met anyway. So yes, I am very much a cheerleader for how far women have come in the Met, and just how bloody minded and brave those first recruits had to be just to keep turning up every day, I think was a huge mark of their success.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a really quick tour through the history of women policing in the Met, but you've managed to have such a lot of detail in there. Now, I don't think that I'm going to have quite as much detail, but similarly to the Met, the City Police did employ women before they actually employed women as police officers. And similarly to the Met, they had matrons in all of the stations to look after children and women who came in. The city also set up its own hospital at Bishopsgate Station for the police, for any police officers who were injured whilst on duty. And this was staffed by a matron and nurses, as well as the police surgeon, who of course was a man. And it was set up in 1865. So there were women employed by the police for a long, long time. Here's a picture from the 1930s of the City of London Police Hospital here, staffed with several of those nurses. And sadly, one of the casualties of the Blitz was one of the nurses in the City of London Police Hospital. She was called Evelyn Rolfe, and this is her book of the complete system of nursing on the right here, which is in our museum. So when we're finally able to reopen again, then hopefully you can come and see it. And it was, yes, it was the I think it was in December 1940. There was a bomb at Bishopsgate, and the building didn't actually suffer that much damage, but Evelyn Rolfe was killed, which was really sad. She was taken to another hospital, St Bart's, and died the next day. There were obviously quite a lot of different buildings in the city as well as across London that were bombed. And during the war as well, similar, this is a Second World War though, not the First World War. Women were taken on in the London Women's Auxiliary Police Corps, and the City of London Police did draw on that corps to help them with particularly after the Blitz, to help to locate people, people's relatives, things like that, but also as drivers, typists, telephonists, and that kind of thing. So that's the big difference, is that there was a big 30-year gap between the taking on of female police officers in the two forces. So it wasn't until 1949 that the first women were taken on as actual police officers in the City of London. And it seems like it, they'd watched what the Met was doing for 30 years and decided that, oh, okay, well, that's, yeah, after 30 years, they seem to be doing all right, so maybe we'll have them too. And of course, there was a huge shortage in manpower at the time, which the commissioner tried several ways to actually improve, including setting up the cadets. But in the end, they had to give in and take on police officers. The Times had said this in a leader in 1940, and so on. So, but it took till 1949, and actually that's when they were recruited. They went on duty in 1950. So, originally 6 constables and a sergeant were taken on. This picture is of the first 5 constables. The 6th and the sergeant had not yet been recruited when these 5 were ready to go on duty. So from left to right, I believe we have Betty Owen, Kathleen Stemp, Margaret Moulton, Jean Panter, and Joan Pegg. So this is from an article from April the 26th in 1950. And the title of the article is, of course, 5 Girls in Blue to Patrol the City. But I know that in a lot of these articles, the media does refer to the first female police officers as girls, but then they talk about police men as boys as well. So the boys in blue. So I don't know whether it was specifically a sexist thing or just the equivalent of boys in blue. That's all. So as Claire says, of course, they're WPCs. By this point, the position of women in the police had already been sorted out through all of the hard work of the Met. And these were WPCs 20 to 24. So yes, they were, some of them were quite young. They were supposed to be recruited from age 19 to 35. So the youngest member of this squad, though, was Betty Owen, who was the first lady on the left. Apparently she was 23, and she was the daughter of a Denbigh farmer. And so this is really interesting because there were London girls as well. Jean Panter, who is the 4th from the left, was a Highgate girl, apparently. But you've also got women recruited from outside London, which is quite a tradition for the City of London Police, and it's partially because there was that height requirement, and often people who were living in London in the 19th and early 20th century, because the pollution didn't quite reach the height requirements for the city. So I think the city girls had to be 5'6", which is actually it's quite high, isn't it? Wasn't it 5'4" in the Met?
5'4" for the Met, yes. I wouldn't have made it.
No, I think 5'6" it's actually quite a few inches above the average as well for a woman, and especially in the 1950s. So what's interesting is, of course, that when you look at their backgrounds, then you find that they've been doing a lot of really interesting things. Kathleen Stemp, who is in the second from the left, she was from Southwold in Suffolk and was a balloon operator during the war. Then you have Margaret Moulton, and she's in the middle. She was Bolton born, so again outside London. She was in the Wrens. She became a Land Army warden, and then she went and worked in an office, but she didn't like it. So she wanted to do something that was more on her feet all day and outside, and so she decided to join the city. Apparently, the women, like the men, have the advice of a trained chiropodist in their jobs, because they were it was hard on the feet. Unlike the men, the women had to patrol in pairs, and this was in concern for their safety. But they didn't really express any kind of worry about going out into the city at all. But they weren't, I believe, allowed to patrol at night either, because of fears for their safety. They had their own 8-room flat at Bishopsgate, which gave them a room each and a living room, and 2 bathrooms they had to share between them. So they're not, they were still kept slightly separate from their male counterparts. Of course, for the city, there were special training to learn about the particular traditions and the history of the city, the customs and procedures that were peculiar to the square mile. And of course, there were several markets within the city at that point as well, where they had to know all of the bylaws regarding all those particular areas. So quite a lot to take in, but I'm sure not more than the ladies in the Met. So through the years, the force grew slightly bigger, and new accommodation was built. So Wood Street Police Station had a whole floor that was set aside for WPCs. And this picture on the right is a picture from 1970 of recruitment, from a recruitment drive, featuring WPC Kathy Birch, and showing her in her bedsit there at Wood Street. They were recruiting more WPCs in the late 50s here on the left, as you can see. But I think from that picture down the bottom left, you can see that again, like in the Met, the women still had special roles to and the expectations to be looking after children who came in and women who came in, and so on. So it was a particular area. We do have some kind of reminiscences about what it was like in the, say, coming into the 60s and 70s, and things like that. So for instance, we've got Kathy Robertson, who was an officer from 1967 to 1999, and she had a bedsit at Wood Street as well. And again says that they didn't do night duty, but they were on call during the night, in the event that anything to do with women or children cropped up. So they could be called out at like 2 a.m. for several hours to deal with something and then have to go and do their normal shift as well. They didn't have very many radios. And so if they didn't have a radio, then they would use the police call boxes that are the ones that look a little bit like TARDISes. Of course, our TARDISes are a bit smaller than your TARDISes, aren't they, Claire?
I don't know. Can we talk about size and TARDISes without getting too?
I know, it's very true. I'm sure they're bigger in size, but because the streets of the city are obviously a bit narrower than in the rest of London.
But I think your police boxes had a nicer colour than ours.
You think so? I think so. It's very nice, like blue. Yeah. They apparently, according to Kathy, the women weren't issued with truncheons or handcuffs, which is not particularly useful. And instead of having pockets, they weren't allowed pockets. They had to have a handbag, although we will talk a little bit more about clothing, I think, in the next video. And of course, they earn 90% of the wages that the men earned. Kathy says that when the equal rights came in, they didn't really take force till 1976, but the women's department was finally disbanded and women were allocated to groups with the men. But they were still called upon to deal with any issues relating to women and children. What's quite interesting is that, the Cadet Force was set up in order to try to recruit young men into the force, but it really didn't fulfill all of the needs of the city. And so, of course, women were recruited. But women weren't allowed to become cadets until 1973 as well. Jacqueline Bond was the first woman to be sworn in as a constable after training as a cadet. So there was still difficulty, I guess, in trying to get people in. We've also got, for instance, there's a lovely article that talked about some of the recruitment into the city police. And it started like this. Janet Pullman is attractive, fun, and a policewoman. So much for the bulky and sulky image. So you can see that as you said, Claire, the media are just absolutely fascinated, and that was in the 70s, you know.
It's really interesting because the focus on what makes a good policewoman is so different from what makes a good policeman. Yeah. So there are press cuttings where, you know, the ideal policewoman should have firm but gentle, yes, good sense of humour, charming, and it reads more like an advert for sort of almost like a dating website. Charm, good, you know, good sense of humour. But there's never any question of detective ability or kind of. It's very much, you know, it's very focused towards a certain type of policing that, frankly, you just don't get when they're talking about male officers.
Yeah, exactly. And for instance, when our museum was being set up, we had some interviews with some of the retiring police officers or retired police officers and serving as well, but Belinda Harding, who is now MBE as well and had 35 years of service in the city police, told us that when she started, she was told, to be considered just as good as your male counterpart, you will have to be twice as good. And she replied, that won't be a problem, will it, sir?
One of my absolute favourite things to do is to talk to retired police officers, especially the women, because especially those who served, say, between the 70s, you know, 60s, 70s, 80s, because their experiences are just amazing. And I was talking to one who'd married a police officer, and she said that although they were supposed to have the same career path, if it was things like both of them asking the sergeant for leave, he'd check with her husband first that those dates worked for him. It wouldn't even occur to him to check with her first. And just, you know, the kind of little things that would just have been an everyday, oh, really, we're having to go through this again. And just, talking about how officially, you know, they weren't supposed to be on the front line of riots or pub fights or anything like that. But it was quickly worked out that actually sometimes sending a female officer into a pub fight diffused the situation far more than sort of 6 burly men barreling through the door.
Well, absolutely.
And they'd be talking down these guys and having a lot more success with it in a lot of instances. And just hearing them talk about, as you say, not having handcuffs or truncheons. I talked to one lady who, thankfully, I don't remember her name because I don't think we could name her, but she said that she would put a brick in her handbag so that if she had to defend herself, she'd swing it at somebody. And
I've heard that story too. I wonder if that's now an urban ex-police legend.
I don't know. Some of these retired policewomen, I wouldn't put it past them.
Yeah, it may well have got around. It's a good thing to do, because otherwise they were pretty defenseless. Yes. I mean, there's talk about how when women were applying to be in different departments in the police, so not just the constable on the beat, there was a lot of resistance and things put in the way. So thinking that women couldn't be in the motorbike squads unless they could lift a motorbike onto its stands, or they shouldn't be any good in the mounted branch, and things like that. But now, of course, there are women in every department. And at nearly every level of responsibility. The City of London Police has never had a female commissioner, but they have had, it's ACPO, isn't it? They've had officers at the level of the Association for Chief Police Officers. So, for instance, Tracy Alexander is the head of the forensics, and who started in the Met, actually, but joined the City, came over to the light side quite a few years ago now. And we also have Inspector Rebecca Walker, for instance, who's now retired, but worked at an advisor at very high profile events like the Olympic Parade, among lots of other jobs in her career. And Ian Dyson, who is the current commissioner for the City of London Police, when we interviewed him for the museum, he talked about how the perception of women has changed from only there to deal with women and children and not worth investing in, as they would marry and leave the force, to one of increased numbers performing the same roles as men, as Clare has said as well. Looking at the stats, you can see that obviously the City of London, like the Met, must publish its stats about its workforce every year. In 2019, which I haven't actually checked if the 2021s are out, they should be, but this was from some research I did a while ago. In 2019, there were 759 officers in the City of London Police and 176 were women. So that's under a quarter. And if we're trying to work towards this half representation, then there's still some way to go. For police support staff in 2019, there were 460 and 264 of those were women, and that's over half. And so that there's still that kind of balance, I think, that still needs to be shifted a little bit. But as you say, they've come a long way. And I just want to point, I know everybody's probably looking at that photo with the women with the masks on and going, the police officers, and they're going, what's going on? And I don't know. So sorry about that.
How wonderfully time appropriate to be showing them wearing masks.
Yes, but I think they're just, I don't know what they are. I don't know. That's something I'd obviously have to do a bit of research on. So thank you so much for watching. If you've made it all the way to the end, well done. This has just been a very quick run through some of the main stories in the history of women in the Met and the City Police. And if you want to contact us, the contact details are on the screen now. Thank you very much, Claire, for joining me again.
Thank you for asking.
And if you have enjoyed this video, then we are going to be doing another one for Women's History Month on the redesign of both the Met and the City's women's uniforms in the 60s to 1970 by a very famous fashion designer, wasn't it, Claire?
very famous, Mr. Norman Hartnell.
So do look out for that. It's fascinating.